April 15th, 1912, the unsinkable Titanic disappears beneath the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people will die, but 705 will live. And every single one of them will survive for one reason. A 22-year-old wireless operator and his exhausted senior partner did something that was strictly forbidden, an illegal decision that would end up becoming the only difference between total silence and 705 people living long enough to see land again. This is Monochrome Documentaries. We bring history's overlooked heroes to center stage. Harold Bride was just 22 years old. He sat in the room, high on Titanic's boat deck, behind a narrow door most passengers never opened. Inside that room was the most powerful communication machine in the world, the Marconi wireless. It was always hot, it vibrated constantly, and it never slept. From this cramped cabin, invisible signals leapt into the dark, to Ireland, to Newfoundland, to anywhere that could hear them. These were among the earliest times when a ship crossing an ocean was not completely alone. Bride worked inches from the transmitter, headphones pressed to his ears, learning the Atlantic through bursts of static and rapid-fire code. The ocean spoke in noise. He learned to translate it, and he was never really alone. Across from him usually sat Jack Phillips, the senior operator, faster, older, already respected among wireless men. Bride didn't just work beside him, he worshipped him. Bride watched Phillips clear backlog after backlog, fingers flying, eyes red, the air thick with heat, and the sharp smell of electricity. Because on this voyage, the wireless wasn't about danger or safety. It was a toy for first-class passengers. They lined up outside the door to send and receive messages ashore. Stock prices, business deals, social notes, messages to newspapers, messages home. Every message meant money from Marconi. Every message meant more hours at the key. The wireless room almost never went quiet. Dots, dashes, crackling static. The Titanic spoke to the world without pause, until on the afternoon of April 14th. It didn't. The crackle vanished. The spark went dark. Bride lifted his headphones. Nothing. The Titanic's only voice had just died. For Harold Bride, the silence was terrifying. The headphones were dead. The spark was gone. The room felt wrong. This machine was the only thing that made the Titanic modern. Without it, they were just another ship. Bride knew what the Marconi rulebook said. If the main transmitter failed at sea, operators were forbidden from attempting any repairs. No exceptions. The equipment was delicate, complex, proprietary. A wrong move could destroy it permanently. You waited for New York. You waited for an engineer, which meant days of silence. Bride looked at the dark face of the transmitter. Then he looked at Phillips. Phillips hadn't slept properly in days. His eyes were red. His hands still rested on the useless key. Waiting meant failure, and Phillips didn't want to fail. "We're fixing it," he said. Bride felt his stomach tighten. They were not engineers. They had no spare parts, no manuals, no permission. If they crossed this line, there was no explaining it away. But Phillips was already opening the panels, so Bride followed him inside the machine. They dismantled the transmitter blind. Wires came loose, plates came away. The smell of hot metal and ozone thickened the air. Bride held the lamp while Phillips worked deeper, both of them searching for something they didn't fully understand. A sudden spark snapped through the cabin. If they were wrong, the wireless would be dead for good, and so would their careers. Finally, buried deep inside the set, Phillips stopped. Then he said quietly, "Here." A short circuit. They stared at it. No proper tools, no spare parts, no instructions. So they improvised. They cut, They bent and they rebuilt. Hands blackened and knuckles burned. Minutes stretched into hours until finally Phillips straightened. He took a breath and threw the switch. A bright electric arc snapped across the transmitter. The headphones burst alive. The cabin flooded with sound. The Titanic had her voice again. Bride felt it hit his chest all at once. For hours, everything he was, his job, his future, his place on this ship, had been hanging in the balance. And now the room was alive. But the moment the radio came back to life, the backlog poured in. Dozens of messages, hours of waiting traffic, all of it suddenly urgent. Phillips dropped into the chair and didn't get back up. He sent Bride to the adjoining cabin. "Just until midnight," he said, "then you can take over." Bride lay down in the narrow bunk, the revived crackle of Morse code bleeding through the wall. Phillips was exhausted, and ships all around them were trying to speak to Titanic. One of them was the SS Californian. Its wireless operator was trying to warn them about massive icebergs. But the signal came in so loud it tore through Phillips's headphones. It drowned out the faint shore station he was trying to reach. Annoyed and desperate to clear the backlog, Phillips snapped back. "Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Minutes later, the Californian's operator switched off his set and went to bed. The closest ship to the Titanic had just gone silent, and the Titanic headed straight toward the iceberg. At 11:40 p.m., the ship shuddered. Not a crash or an explosion, just a long, strange tearing sensation that ran through the Titanic's body. In the small bunk beside the wireless room, Harold Bride's eyes snapped open. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The familiar vibration of the engines had changed. Bride pulled on his jacket and stepped into the radio room. "What was that?" he asked. Phillips didn't look up from the key. "I don't know," he said. Then the door opened. Captain Edward Smith stepped inside. "We've struck an iceberg," he said calmly. "You should prepare to send a call for assistance, but don't send it yet." And he left. Bride stared at Phillips. Neither of them spoke. Outside their cabin, the largest ship on Earth was already bleeding open. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. This time, the calm was gone. "The ship is sinking," the captain said. "Send the call for assistance." He placed the ship's position on the table. Phillips sat forward, and the machine they had resurrected hours earlier finally spoke for its true purpose. His fingers came down on the key. "CQD, come quick. Danger. CQD MGY. We have struck an iceberg. Come at once." The message leapt from the Titanic into the black Atlantic. Bride stood beside him, suddenly wide awake, running slips, listening to distant stations answering back. Then a thought cut through him. He leaned in. "Send SOS. It is the new distress call," he said. Phillips didn't stop. He simply added it. CQD, SOS, again and again. The Titanic became one of the first ships in history to cry for help with the signal the world now recognizes. Wireless rooms across the North Atlantic came alive. One of them belonged to a Cunard liner called the Carpathia. 58 nautical miles away, its lone operator, Harold Cottam, was preparing for bed when he decided to check in with Titanic one last time. What came back made him run. On the bridge, Captain Arthur Rostron was woken. Within minutes, he had turned the ship around, diverted all available steam to the engines, shut down heating, posted extra lookouts, and aimed his ship straight into the same ice field that was tearing Titanic apart. Carpathia surged into the darkness at full speed. It was a gamble. It was also the only chance. Back on Titanic, the wireless room had become the ship's heart. Water was spreading. The deck was beginning to tilt. Bride ran messages between the bridge and the cabin, putting passengers off in small boats. Engine room full to the boilers. Phillips never stopped sending. For nearly 2 hours, he hammered the key, throwing their position and their condition into the void. The radio that had been a toy that morning was now the only reason anyone might come. But wireless could not stop water, and it could not stop time. And as Bride watched the messages go out into the dark, one question began to drown out all the others. Not will anyone hear them, but will anyone reach them before the Titanic is gone? As the sinking entered its second hour, the ship was no longer evacuating. It was disintegrating. The deck had begun to tilt. Water was climbing. The cold was no longer distant. It was in the air. But inside the Marconi room, Jack Phillips did not move. The lights flickered. The generators below were drowning. The wireless signal weakened. Still, Phillips sent dots, dashes, but fainter now. Around 2:00 a.m., the door opened for the last time. Captain Smith stepped inside. He did not look at the radio. He looked at the men. "You have done your full duty," he said. "You can do no more." Then the sentence no sailor ever wanted to hear. "Abandon your cabin. Now it's every man for himself." And he was gone. The authority of the ship had just left the room. Harold Bride began gathering their money, but Jack Phillips did not. He turned back to the key and kept sending. Bride would later say, "I will never forget the work of Phillips in those last awful minutes. I learned to love him that night." The lights dimmed again, the signal thinned, and then the chaos outside broke into their room. A crewman from below deck burst in, wild-eyed, breathing hard. He saw the life vest on Phillips's back and lunged for it. Phillips didn't even turn. For Bride, something snapped. He threw himself at the man, and they went down together. Water was already pouring through the doorway. Bride forced him back, held him down, and when a surge rolled through the room, the sea tore the man away. Phillips was still sending messages until finally the power died. The room darkened. The key went dead. The Titanic went silent. They stepped out of the cabin into a ship that was no longer level. The deck had become a slope. Water was washing across the bridge. The stern was lifting. Bride ran to a collapsible boat that had been torn from the officers' quarters and lay upside down on the deck. For the next few seconds, he was safe. He looked back to see if Phillips had made it. And then a wave hit. The ocean lifted him and pulled him under. The cold seized him. But Bride kicked and fought. He tore himself back to the surface, and by sheer luck, his hands struck wood. He clung onto it, pulled it, and dragged himself onto the overturned hull. 24 men were already there, shaking, moaning, clinging. From this broken raft, Harold Bride watched the Titanic die. He heard machinery tear loose inside her, then 2 tremendous cracks as the hull split. And at 2:20 a.m., the stern slid under. The Atlantic closed, and the night filled with sound. Not engines, not radios, only screaming. For nearly 2 more hours, Harold Bride clung to the overturned hull. The men around him stopped speaking. Some stopped moving. The cold did what the water had not. And then, a light. A pale glow on the black edge of the ocean. A ship. After a blind, full-speed run through the ice, Captain Rostron's gamble had worked. Just after 4 o'clock in the morning, the Carpathia reached Titanic's last position, and the Atlantic began to give people back, boat by boat, body by body. Harold Bride was among the last to be pulled from the water. He couldn't stand. The cold had crushed his feet. Sailors lifted him under the arms and carried him aboard, wrapped him, laid him down. For the first time since the radio room went dark, Harold Bride was no longer responsible for anything, but the wireless was, and it was alive. The Carpathia's own operator, Harold Cottam, had been awake for nearly a full day, first talking to Titanic, then coordinating the search, now facing the impossible task of answering the world. Names, questions, mothers, newspapers. There were hundreds of people alive, and thousands who were not, and Cottam was breaking under immense pressure. When word reached Bride, he didn't hesitate. Despite the pain, he asked to be taken to the wireless room. They carried him in, propped him in a chair, wrapped his ruined feet, and placed the headphones over his ears. The same sound filled them. Dots, dashes, static. For the rest of the voyage to New York, the two heralds sat side by side, one sending, one receiving, transmitting survivor lists, personal messages, final words. The boy who had broken the rules to give the Titanic a voice was now using another ship's radio to tell the world who was still alive and who was not. Jack Phillips never made it out. The man who had refused to leave the key, who had kept sending until the ship itself went silent, died somewhere in the water that night. His body was never identified. He was one of more than 1,500. The world not move on quietly. The inquiries that followed focused on one thing above all others: the radio. The fact that anyone was saved at all was because two young men refused to let a machine stay dead, and because nearby ships had gone silent. After Titanic, that was no longer allowed. Ships were required to keep radios manned, day and night. Never again would a nearby vessel sleep through a cry for help. Never again would the ocean be allowed to go completely quiet, because on one freezing night in 1912, the world learned what silence really cost. Harold Bride never became famous. He didn't tour, he didn't lecture. After the inquiries ended, he went back to ordinary life. He worked, he married, and he lived quietly. But every person who stepped off a lifeboat that morning carried a piece of what he and Jack Phillips had done. Phillips never saw land again. The man who stayed at the quay while the world fell apart died somewhere in the dark water that night. His body was never identified. Between them, there is no monument, no statue, no great speech. There is only this: because two young radio operators refused to let a machine stay silent, the ocean spoke, and 705 people lived long enough to answer. Thanks for watching.